Start recording.
And we're going to start the broadcast. 3, 2, 1.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone and welcome to the 41st Canadian Sustainability Indicators Network Learning Event. My name is Carla Zubricki and I'm the coordinator of CSIN. I'll be running things for this webinar from our office here in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, with the help of my colleague at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, Pauline Gerard. Please note that today's presentation will be recorded and made available to CSIN members on our website. Also, I'm going to take note of any documents that come up in discussion that would help us in our learning, and I'll try to email them to participants after the webinar if possible. I've also been alerted to another webinar this week in which one of our CSIN members is participating, so I'd like to share that with you. Amy Greenwood from the Fraser Basin Council will be presenting this Thursday, December 5th, on Sustainability in Action and Performance Measurement for the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. So later today, I'm going to send out an email with the link to that webinar. So please keep an eye out for that if you're interested. Finally, I'm in the process of writing up the next edition of CSIN News. So if you happen to have any news or resources on sustainability and indicators that you'd like to share, either something from your organization or just an interesting article or piece of information that you've come across, I'd love it if you sent it to me so I could include it and share it with members. Now, we are very excited to welcome a diverse crowd of participants today and a presenter with some great lessons to share. The 41st CSIN Learning Event is entitled Developing Human Wellbeing Indicators for the Hood Canal. Our presenter is Dr. Kelly Biedenweg. She is lead social scientist at the Puget Sound Institute and is presenting to us today on a process that she was involved in to select human well-being indicators relevant to natural resources management in the Hood Canal in the state of Washington. And I've read the related report, and there was a lot of sophisticated thinking and planning that went into this process, and I certainly learned a lot from it. And I'm hoping that many of you will learn something new as well, and maybe have questions for Kelly afterwards. Today's learning event is scheduled to run from 11 a.m. Central Time, so that's Winnipeg time. It's at 9 a.m. on the Pacific Coast, until 12 p.m. Central Time. The presentation will last about 20 minutes, after which time we will have a Q&A session. And if you do have questions, I'd ask you to type them into the chat or discussion window that you should see in front of you. We'll hold all the questions until after the presentation, and then I, as moderator, will read out any questions you might have, and then feel free to ask follow-up questions if you have them. Because we've learned that through past webinar experience that doing it this way is a bit easier than trying to make the microphones work on everyone's computers. So were there any last-minute questions before we start? And if you have any, you can just type them into the chat window. I don't see any. So, okay then, I will officially start things off by handing the controls over to Kelly so that the presentation can begin.
You all as Carla mentioned, I am. Is the go-to panel blocking my screen at all? I'll just assume that it's not.
It looks okay.
So, okay, great. So I work as the lead social scientist for the Puget Sound Institute, which is based out of the University of Washington-Tacoma. But we share a building with the Puget Sound Partnership, which some of you may know is a state-funded agency that is in charge of coordinating the restoration of the Puget Sound. And the Puget Sound is the area around the Seattle area on the west coast of Washington, and I don't know if you can see with my pointer or not, but that area in the box that is highlighted with the black outline is Washington State. So the majority of our research at the Puget Sound Institute, we have four scientists, sorry, I'm the only social scientist, is to develop research and tools that will help the partnership's effort to coordinate restoration of the Puget Sound. And one of the things that the partnership is in charge of is developing vital signs. And these vital signs are the ways that we know if our coordination efforts are working or not. And I'm not going to give a deep presentation of the vital signs in general. There's been a pretty extensive process involved in developing these. And if you would like to learn more about that process that's happened over the last 8 or so years, then Natalie Hamill, who works for the partnership, would be happy to do a future presentation. But I'll give a quick overview. You'll see that those vital signs are separated into different domains. And they essentially are indicators that help track the progress of the ecosystem. And I will add that it's actually the social ecosystem. Up until this year, actually, the human side of the vital signs and the tracking has not existed. So that's exactly what I'm going to present to you is that. They are made up of the things that we care about and want to move the needle on across goals and ecosystem components. They are Puget Sound wide, which means that we can't create an indicator that only works for one piece of the Puget Sound. We only can create vital sign indicators that can roll up to the entire Puget Sound scale. And most of them have targets for 2020. And when I say the Puget Sound, that area, what I think I forgot to say is it's about 160 kilometers long and in parts gets to about 280 meters deep. So it's quite a large body and a very diverse region of people and resources. There are different types of vital signs that the partnership is tracking. Some of them are biophysical. There's also human well-being. Some of them are pressures. That means things that are actually hurting the biophysical and human well-being status. Some of them are the way people respond to a management strategy, and some of them are a social response. And I'm specifically going to talk about that second category, the human well-being category. Just a little bit more information on the vital signs. The way that we actually capture the data for those vital signs is that we collaborate or coordinate different organizations and different scientists who are already collecting this type of data. So it's not, for the most part, brand new data collection for us at all. In fact, we're trying to build on efforts that are already happening and pull them together. So the human well-being piece of the vital signs basically received a placeholder in the writing of the laws that govern the Puget Sound Partnership. And you'll see in there a quality of life index and a sound behavior index. The behavior index was created last year. The quality of life index is specifically what we were aiming to focus on with this project, but we also are including pretty much all of the pieces of the healthy human population and the recreational fishing and commercial fisheries harvest that you see in the human quality of life. So we're looking at potentially condensing these into one indicator, or even maintaining the domains, but they would be a little different than what they look like right now. Before I head into what is the context for this, the reason why there's been no movement on human well-being indicators is partly because there has been no social scientist involved in the partnership or in the Institute. My position was just created this month, in fact, but I have been working with the partnership over the last year on this project. And there was a lot of hesitation that we would actually be able to develop human well-being indicators, again, relevant to natural resources, that would be scalable to the entire basin. And so to start exploring whether that's possible, we decided to first focus on one watershed of the Puget Sound Basin, and then see if it was able to be done in a systematic way there, see if we want to continue going across different watersheds or have enough evidence that we can actually scale up from there. So I'll just give a little bit of the theoretical context for this. This is how we think about this here in the Puget Sound. But first of all, the reason why we even want a human well-being index is because human well-being influences our behaviors. It's not the only thing that influences our behaviors, but it's a pretty big piece that influences our behaviors, and our behaviors in turn influence human well-being. Examples when I say behaviors are things like very active, like fishing. It can also include just seeking education or engaging in advocacy. Those human behaviors can create pressures, as I mentioned before, or they can enhance some of the ecological targets that are important to us. And some of those here in the Puget Sound, as I'm sure are with you, include water quality. For us, we have healthy shellfish beds. They're a pretty big big piece of our economy and our ecosystem, so we want to maintain those. Those ecological targets create what we consider ecosystem services, and those services can directly influence our human well-being. So we've now got a loop here that forces us to take human well-being into some pretty serious consideration. Now we see that human well-being can influence those targets, and those ecological targets can in turn influence human well-being. So when we see that those targets might be not at the level we want when we're seeing our vital signs, we might implement a management strategy. A management strategy might be something like education and outreach. It might be to improve our regulations, or it might be to protect our priority habitat. And one of the things that we really try to remember is that those management strategies as well have an impact on human well-being. They may, the process of developing them may have a piece that influences the social justice, or it may actually create some sort of incentive system that increases the economic foundation of our well-being. So just to kind of clarify in partnership terms, pressures or opportunities are this human behavior part of this model, and the human well-being or the quality of life indicators are this human well-being model that's represented here in a circle. And if you are familiar with the Ocean Health Index, we directly stole this image from them in collaboration with them, so I admit to that immediately. But this is this gray part, the human well-being or quality of life, is the part I'm going to be talking about right now. We did not work on developing indicators yet for these human behavior pressures or opportunities. So the first step we went about was to define these human well-being domains, and this was really based off of a lot of work that's already been done, and in fact, Canada is one of the leaders in this, in the Canadian Index of Wellbeing, as well as looking at the Bhutan's Gross National Happiness Indicator set that was developed off of Canada's index, and then working with other groups throughout the world who have created specific domains and indicators relevant to natural resources. So we have the psychological domain, which includes cognitive and emotional health. We have the social domain, which includes our family and our friendship ties. We have the cultural domain, the economic domain. We started out with the spiritual domain, and I'll explain a little later that we ended up not keeping it as a separate domain. There wasn't enough to fill it. And the more we looked into other types of domain development, the more we found that spiritual is actually an attribute of psychological well-being. With tribal communities, spiritual is often an attribute of the cultural domain. So none of these domains are meant to be exclusive. They're just meant to force us to make sure we consider all the different attributes of human well-being. The physical, what we mean by that is our biophysical health, so that relates to things that we often measure, like air quality and toxicity and exercise. Those are some of the more easier, often tangible and objective measures. And then governance. Just to show you a little bit of a crosswalk back to the Canadian Index of Wellbeing, I would imagine that many of you are familiar with it. These terms very well cross back to some of the things that are there. Environment, of course, is not in there because every single indicator that we're going to develop is related specifically to the health of the environment. So we don't need specific measures for the environment. We already have those in 2/3 of the vital signs. And time use and education, we didn't actually develop this wheel directly off of Canadian Index of Wellbeing, so there wasn't a conscious decision to not include them, but they are incorporated into aspects of the other domains. So I'll talk about this process. As I mentioned, we developed the 7 domains, but we now have 6 domains, and then we found one watershed that we wanted to work in to test a process for how we could come up with human well-being indicators. And this is a pretty systematic and pretty in-depth process. As Carla mentioned, we put a lot of thought into this because there were a lot of concerns about what would be fair and how could you actually measure human well-being, considering that they're not really agreed upon standards for what are objective versus subjective measures of human well-being. So the first thing we did is we hired a graduate student to help us do a review of literature throughout the entire Puget Sound. And what she did was she compiled lists from reports from county and city and state agencies, as well as nonprofit groups who had social indicators related to the Puget Sound. And this list actually is not just natural resource indicators. Some of them are general social indicators and social well-being indicators. She came up with 1,400 indicators that are already being measured in the Puget Sound. And this was how we wanted to start. We didn't want to invent the wheel. We wanted to try to build off efforts that are already happening, which is really part of the mission of the partnership, is to coordinate. After that review, we wanted to think specifically about Hood Canal and what makes Hood Canal unique. This is the water that we focused on. And so we conducted a literature review and several interviews. I did 19 interviews, open-ended interviews with residents throughout the Hood Canal. And those interviews were a snowball sample where one person was recommended to me. I interviewed them and I asked them the question, what is it about living in the Hood Canal that contributes to your well-being? And they would talk anywhere from 15 minutes to 3 hours about it in that open question. And then at the end of the interview, I would ask them to recommend somebody else I should talk to who had a very different perspective or very different experience in Hood Canal than they did. And for the most part, people were glad to recommend someone who thought differently than they did. We got to at the end of 19, we started saturating the different ideas that people think about, which is a standard social science concept. So at that point, we felt we were fine not doing any more interviews. But we also did a literature review of research that's already been done in the Hood Canal, and there have been several extension agents and different types of projects that have already looked at how people connect to nature in Hood Canal. And so from those interviews and that literature review, we came up with 140 themes that fit each of the domains. So on the left side of this table, you'll see the different domains, and then we called the themes essentially attributes. They're not quite attributes yet, but they're getting there. And these are things that came up over and over again in the interviews and in the literature review that we saw. So here we have the start of something that is more place-based and specific. Then we decided to merge the review of Puget Sound that was the exact specific objective social indicators with these attributes that were more Hood Canal oriented. And the way we were able to do that is because the Puget Sound literature review, those indicators were also coded into the 7 domains, just as in the prior slides you saw that the Hood Canal interviews and literature were coded into the 7 domains. And so we started looking at the domain, and then we looked at the attributes specific to Hood Canal, and then we looked at that Puget Sound list, this big Excel spreadsheet of indicators, and we looked for indicators that matched that attribute, that made sense for that attribute. And if there weren't indicators that made sense for that attribute, then we would create one. We ended up with 180 precise indicators from this merge. The majority of those are already existing and being measured somewhere, not entirely throughout the Puget Sound, and not necessarily in Hood Canal, but somebody has made a decision, a thoughtful decision, to be measuring those somewhere. The next stages we wanted to go through were more participatory, and to do something more participatory, in my experience, I learned that we want to start with a really good, solid set of indicators that are not too redundant, or that are also not oversimplified. And so 180 was still too much for that. So we have a team of 5 people working on this project, and we went through an internal ranking of those 180 precise indicators that are divided by domain. And we thought specifically how many of these indicators, or we ranked them on a scale of 1 to 5, which of these indicators are Hood Canal relevant and which of them are not redundant. And we ended up having a total of 100, what I'm calling parsimonious, for lack of a much better word, indicators, meaning that they weren't redundant with each other. We had a lot of indicators that differed mostly in the time scale, like how often you exercise per day versus how often you exercise per month type of example. And then there were some things that just we knew were not going to end up in the top 10 list for an index. So for example, safety and security is a big issue in human well-being, but it's probably not going to be number 1, the idea of measuring how safe you feel in your home neighborhood when we're talking about natural resource health in the Hood Canal, which is a very forested and rural area. So with those 100 parsimonious indicators, we decided to hold what we called expert stakeholder workshops. And what I mean by expert is that we invited people who can think on a broad scale and represent that watershed. So these were all Hood Canal residents, so representative of Hood Canal, people who have probably collected data, so often people from public health departments or people from economic development centers for the counties or cities. And so they have a pretty good sense of what actually varies and what actually measures of high importance within the region, and also have a sense of where data might exist for that region. So those experts, in total, there were 32 of them that participated in 3 different workshops, and we did the workshops in 3 locations across the Hood Canal, And the reason we chose the 3 locations was so people wouldn't have to travel very far to get to them, and also because this way we were able to have a sample of 3. We did the exact same process in 3 different places, and so we were able to see if there was too much diversity to see if this process actually might create some bias by it being a community-based process. So when people arrived, it was a 3-hour workshop, and we put them into 4 tables, one of 4 tables. The cultural, spiritual, and social table were people who had expertise in those domains. The governance table were people who had expertise in that domain. Then economic and psychological and physical health were placed together because it's often people who work in public health that work in both of those domains. Each of the tables had a facilitator, one of my team, and that facilitator had a laptop and a spreadsheet of each of the indicators, each of those 100 indicators, and they took a lot of notes of everything that was discussed in that process of selecting the indicators that people wanted for the Hood Canal. There were 2 different steps that people went through in this process, in this workshop. The first step was pretty quick, and it was to get everybody on the same page. We had, as you see in this picture, large printouts of the indicators for each of the tables. So, as I said, we had 100 indicators by each table. There were 4 tables, so each table received about 22 to 27 of the indicators, and the indicators were separated by the domain and by the attribute. And to get people on the same page, we had them individually walk up to those posters and place a sticker next to each indicator that would say specifically how well that indicator represented the main issues in Hood Canal human well-being. So they put either a green or a blue sticker if they thought it was already a great indicator. They placed a yellow sticker if they thought it would be a good indicator with some refinement. It wasn't quite right, but it was getting there. And then a red if this is just not going to make it to the top 5 of our indicators. This step helps get everybody on the same page early on, even though we handed them the indicators before, sent them in by email the indicators before the workshop. Many people don't have time, or they may have walked in after having just been at work, for example, and haven't really settled into what they're thinking about. So this helps people get in the space of the day, but also helps us see immediately where there's agreement and where there's disagreement. And in workshops where I participated in indicator selection in the past, when we've jumped directly into just talking about the indicators, we often find a half an hour later that we've been arguing about things we already agree on or that we already agree to disagree on. And so this helped us really facilitate the movement of the process. That took about 20 minutes, and then the second step was for the group to sit down with their facilitator and have a discussion about the indicators, narrow it down to the top 5 or 10. And this, we didn't say 5, we said 5 or 10. So not every group came up with the same number of top indicators. Each group did it a little bit differently. Some of them chose to talk about the ones that were yellow and refine them. Some of them chose to talk about all of them. It depended on the facilitator, and it depended on how comfortable the groups were with what process. But at the end, they all narrowed their indicators down. So at the end of the 3 workshops, there's different ways you can summarize that information. So I summarized it in 2 different ways. The first way was, out of all 3 workshops, 15 indicators were recommended by all 3 workshops as being the most important indicators for human well-being for Hood Canal, and those 15 indicators represented all of the domains. But we didn't want to go that narrow just yet, so if we looked at all of the indicators that were recommended by 2 of the workshops, there were 41 indicators that at least 2 workshops recommended in their top 5 or 10. So the 15 is a subset of the 41. With that 41 set of highly ranked indicators being the most relevant and most important to Hood Canal, we then approached a group of social scientists 9 of them, and these are social scientists who work specifically in indicator development and specifically in the region. And we asked them to rate them based on how robust and practical they were. And robust means that it is a true measure of that domain. So, for example, we don't want people to be asking how happy you are as an indicator of identity. That's not appropriate. That are just slightly off, and we don't figure it out until we start analyzing the data. And then the second thing we asked is their opinion on the practicality. And practicality means how well would we be able to measure this, assuming that we would be able to do a region-wide phone or household survey. So from those, the social scientists, of the 41 that I handed them, they recommended 19, and those 19 were rated at 4 or higher on a scale of 5, which means they were really highly ranked by all the social scientists. So what we presented to the Hood Canal Coordinating Council, which is a coalition of governments in the Hood Canal watershed, made up of 2 tribes and 3 counties, were these 26 indicators. These 26 indicators include the 15 that were recommended by the three workshops, and the 19 that were recommended by the social scientists. And the reason why it's 26 and not 15 plus 19 is because there was some overlap in those indicators by the workshops and by the scientists. So we've presented these to that Hood Canal Coordinating Council and a group of 100 people, and they all are excited about this. And of course, their #1 question is, now what? We're really happy this is finally being given attention, but can we actually collect the data? And if so, what would we actually do with it? So these are just a couple of examples of how we would, assuming that one of the petals in these diagrams would be one of the indicators, and you would have a standard measure for it on a constructed scale, maybe of 1 to 5. You could look at changes from year 1 to year 2, maybe based on strategies that have been implemented. You could also potentially look at any differences in demographics. So maybe if the one on the left represented females and the one on the right represented males, we could look for any disparity in social justice issues. The same is true for socioeconomic status and age groups. And that's one of the things that I want to express and highlight, is that we don't have a social justice domain. However, the concept is central to this whole thing, in that every single indicator must be measured across the different demographics, and they must be disaggregated across the different demographics. So you can look at differences in gender, differences in spatial location where people live, differences in socioeconomic status. So we feel that what happened was very successful. Right now, the Hood Canal Coordinating Council has hired one of our team members to help them integrate those 26 indicators into their current integrated watershed plan. And we look forward to seeing that final process of how it's happening. But now we have to decide for the Puget Sound, what are we going to do? You can see here a map of all the different watersheds in the Puget Sound, and the Hood Canal is the one on the left with the check mark. Now, do we head up a scale and go all the way to the Puget Sound, or do we do a couple more watersheds first and see if there's any similarities across watersheds? And the decision we've reached is that we need to do a couple more watersheds that are different. They're different in that they are either more urban or that they're more agricultural. Hood Canal is very much a natural resource-based economy, and it's got a low population rate, and the majority of people tend to be conservation-oriented. That's not necessarily the case in all of the watersheds around the Puget Sound. So we're going to continue that same process in at least 1 or 2 more watersheds, and then we will look at and see how much similarity there is before we make the decision of whether we can scale all the way up to Puget Sound. We do know that we will have at least a handful of indicators that we will have at the Puget Sound scale to fill in that vital sign wheel. So I think that that's all I have. I'd like to open it up for questions. And thank you for your attention.
Okay, so if Carla's speaking here again, thank you so much for the presentation, Kelly. If anyone has some questions, and I'm sure some of you do, if you can type them into the chat window that you should see in front of you. While you're doing that, maybe I'll start out with a question while you guys are perhaps finding the chat window. When you're expanding to different watersheds, Kelly, I'm wondering if you're expecting to use the same kind of process that you used for the Hood Canal, and also how similar do you think the indicators that you're going to come up with might be, or do you think they're going to be somewhat different because it's such a participatory process that you're using? Could you comment a bit on that?
Yeah, thanks for that comment, Carla. So we are going to try to use the same process. We may or may not have as extensive of a literature review and interview for the other watersheds, but we will still start with the indicators that exist in the Puget Sound. It is a participatory process, but at the same time, it's spread across. So that Hood Canal process, we did it in 3 different regions, and each of those regions is pretty different from each other. And that was one of the things that was interesting about doing 3 different workshops, is there wasn't as much variation as we thought there would be variation. And I think this comes down to the fact that these are indicators. They're the things that we agree are important to measure, but they're not the direction we necessarily want them to go that we care about. So for example, everyone in the room agrees that we want to measure the timber economy in the watershed. So not everyone agrees which direction that should go, but that's not what the discussion is about. The discussion is about which of these things should we measure. So I actually think that we will be able to come up with a handful of indicators that people are happy with. It's the target setting afterwards that will probably be a little bit more problematic. That said, each of the regions is slightly different, or not slightly, substantially different in their demographics, and that's exactly why we decided we want to do at least 1 or 2 more watersheds, so it can be a little bit more of a systematic scientific process and figure out how similar things are. For the most part, human well-being indicators that have been developed in the past, aside from the Canadian Index of Wellbeing, actually, from my understanding of that development, but the other indicator processes I've learned about in the last few years, they often have not had a participatory process at all, and they've developed these broad concepts based on expert opinion. And so I think this will be a really interesting test of whether that is true and whether we should be doing that or not.
Thanks, Kelly. Yeah, I think it makes sense to slowly replicate and scale up. We've experienced thinking like that at IISD too as we're working with indicators. The questions are starting to pour in now. So I'll just read them off in the order that I've gotten them. So Steve Litke from the Fraser Basin Council is asking, you mentioned conducting a survey to gather the data. Is that going to be the primary source of indicator data, or are there other sources that will supplement a survey? And then another question, what is the anticipated frequency of updating the indicator data?
That's a great question, and these are still conversations that we need to have. We really just wanted to try to catch up to the other vital signs by even having indicators to begin with. But we have thought through it a little bit, of course, and I think that to be realistic for the partnership, the survey will probably be the primary measure because that's how other data are collected, and it would be the most cost-effective as opposed to maybe workshops or focus groups. But I still would like to have that conversation with them of finding ways that we can get more qualitative information incorporated into it. What was the second piece of his question?
What is the anticipated frequency of updating the indicator data?
Probably, most likely, right now the behavior index is every 3 years, and what we're thinking is that we would probably incorporate it as part of the behavior index survey. So it would probably be about every 3 years.
Okay, thanks. And if you have any follow-up questions, Steve, just feel free to type them into the question box there. The next question is from Shivanand Balaram, and he's asking, was it a challenge to have the stakeholders accept the invitation to attend the workshop? Did any decline invitation?
Absolutely. I don't have the number right in front of me, but I believe we invited about 116 people. We got 30. My experience with workshops is that that's not at all out of the norm, and the people who accepted were thrilled to come. They were very happy to come, and you can definitely say that there might be bias then of who chose to come versus who didn't. At the same time, the people who came are still representatives of government bodies who are collecting data for the most part, or with an economic agency. But it was very hard to get participation in the way it often is. We did a lot of emails, a lot of calls, cold calls, and I had hired a graduate student to help, and it probably took her about 3 weeks to prepare for the 3 workshops and phone calls and emails.
Okay, thanks. And the next question is from Mike Pudister. I know he's from Credit Valley Conservation in Ontario, and his question is, well, first of all, he thanks you thanks you very much for your helpful presentation, and he's wondering, can you take us back to your table of 26, and if you can drill down a little on what targets and data that you would propose to measure?
Yeah, so the indicator is specifically the measure that we would be measuring. Some of these, like I said, would be surveys. Some of them are already measured. So for example, if we look at physical, the safe drinking water testing results from community groups and wells, that already exists within the health department, as does the safe food, the toxin levels, and the air quality. So those are things that are already being measured. Percent of swimming beaches that meet safe swimming standards at all times during the summer. That is mostly measured. What we would have to do is some sort of a cleaning of the data to make sure to look at the all times during the summer. But we do know which swimming beaches have safe swimming. That data is collected. Something like access to local food, availability of commonly harvested species, that would only be able to be gotten through a survey because that's not anything we have data for. So we're looking for the most direct piece of data as opposed to a proxy that would maybe look at land cover and assume that those commonly harvested species are there, or even we've considered things like permits that people might grab for clams and crabbing and deer and elk, and that's possible to use, but we already know that there's a lot of faults with that data, which is why we like the idea of doing a household survey. I think that hopefully that answers.
I actually have one follow-up question on specific indicators, just because I know that one of our